Were you ever told about the hidden whispers in the deep Middle Ages, the hushed meetings in forgotten crypts, the forbidden scrolls passed hand to hand under cover of night? Do you know what truly shocking ideas were debated in those shadowed corners? Concepts that could shatter the very bedrock of the world as they knew it all before the year 1500. Number 6. The Doctrine of the Plurality of Worlds and Infinite Universes. Deep within the stone heart of medieval Europe, far from the watchful eyes of bishops and inquisitors, a few minds dared to think beyond the comfortable enclosed cosmos taught by the Church. These were not the common folk, nor even the openly learned masters in the burgeoning universities. These were men and women of unusual curiosity. Sometimes renegade scholars, sometimes isolated alchemists, sometimes hermits with access to ancient forgotten texts. They gathered in secret, perhaps in the drafty, dust-choked library of a monastery whose abbot was more interested in ancient philosophy than orthodox dogma. Maybe in the quiet, fire-lit chambers of a merchant's house, where foreign scrolls were smuggled in with precious spices. Or perhaps in the remote, overgrown ruins of a Roman villa, where the very air seemed to hum with forgotten knowledge. Their secret, one of the most unsettling ideas they cherished, was the belief that their world, the one they saw around them, was not the sole creation in existence. It was not the only Earth. They called it the Doctrine of the Plurality of Worlds. This was not a simple guess. It was a reasoned conclusion, built upon fragments of ancient wisdom that had survived the collapse of empires and the burning of libraries. They sought out texts from philosophers like Democritus and Epicurus, whose ideas about a universe made of tiny, indivisible particles, atoms, also suggested an infinite void where countless combinations of these particles could form. Critias, a Roman poet, had eloquently described such a cosmos in his work On the Nature of Things, a book considered deeply suspect by Christian thinkers. Copies of this text were rare, often incomplete, hidden away in private collections or within the walls of monastic libraries, where they were filed under pagan philosophy and largely ignored by those who upheld the prevailing views. Yet a few sought them out. These secret circles would study these fragments. They would pore over diagrams of the heavens, not just the neat concentric spheres of Ptolemy's model, but older, more speculative charts. They discussed the implications of certain astronomical observations, the appearance of a new bright star in the sky, or the strange fleeting shadows that danced across the moon. The established teaching declared that the Earth was the center, the unique stage for God's great drama of creation and salvation. Above it spun the perfect, unchanging celestial spheres, each carrying a planet all enclosed within a final sphere of fixed stars. Beyond that, nothing. Just the Empyrean, the dwelling place of God. This doctrine gave humanity a unique central role in the cosmos, a singular importance to the Creator. The seeker doctrine, however, pushed past this comfortable notion. If God was truly all-powerful, they reasoned, if his creative potential was infinite, then why would he limit himself to one single creation? Could he not create endless worlds? Worlds perhaps like their own, teeming with life, or worlds utterly unlike anything they could imagine. Some even hypothesized that if the universe was truly infinite, stretching forever in all directions, then there must be other suns and other Earths, perhaps an endless number of them, each with its own stories, its own creatures. They wrestled with the idea that the laws of nature as they understood them might not be universally applicable across all these imagined realms. One scholar, known only by his whispered pseudonym, the cosmographer, was said to have developed intricate calculations based on arcane geometries and astronomical tables obtained from Arab scholars to suggest that the huge distances between celestial bodies implied an unimaginable vastness, far greater than any map of the known universe could depict. He argued that if the stars were truly as distant as they appeared, they must be other suns, and where there was a sun, there could be planets. The implications of this idea were staggering. If there were other worlds, did they also have inhabitants? Did those inhabitants have souls? If so, did they also require salvations, like Adam and Eve? Did they also require salvations? And if they did the Son of God, Jesus Christ, have to visit each and every one of these countless worlds to offer redemption? The very notion threatened to unravel the entire fabric of Christian theology, which was built upon the unique, singular event of the incarnation on earth. The authority of the Church, which derived its power from its role as the sole mediator between God and humanity on this singular world, would crumble under such a revelation. The books of the Bible, which spoke of one creation, one fall, one redemption, would seem incomplete, perhaps even false. Cosmic observers, as some called themselves, lived in constant apprehension. They knew that such thoughts were considered heresy, a direct challenge to the omnipotence and wisdom of God, as revealed through Scripture and church dogma. To suggest that God's creative power was so vast that it extended beyond their singular world, while seemingly praising His greatness, paradoxically diminished humanity's special place. It made them merely one among countless possibilities, one speck in an infinite cosmic dust. They concealed their findings, sharing them only with those they trusted most deeply, often through coded messages or by hiding their most dangerous interpretations within innocent-looking commentaries on classical text. An old Benedictine manuscript from the 12th century, detailing an imagined journey through celestial spheres, was found to have tiny, almost invisible annotations along the margins, sketching out impossible star systems and suggesting other unseen suns. The fear of discovery was ever present, for the consequences were not merely academic debate, but imprisonment, torture, or even death by burning at the stake, a grim fate reserved for those who dared to defy the established truths of the cosmos. Number 5. The Principle of Absolute Relativism, in Truth and Morality. In the shadows of soaring cathedrals and the strict confines of monastic orders, another unsettling idea began to circulate, passed from hand to hand, sometimes in spoken whispers, sometimes hidden within seemingly innocuous philosophical treatises. This dangerous concept challenged the very bedrock of medieval thought, the existence of absolute universal truths and unwavering moral laws handed down from God. It was the principle of absolute relativism. The medieval mind was structured around certainty. God had created the world, defined its laws, and revealed His will through sacred texts and the teachings of the Church. Truth was fixed, eternal, and knowable through divine revelation and reason. Morality was equally absolute, prescribed by commandments and church decrees. Right and wrong were not matters of opinion, but divine decree. However, certain individuals, often those who had traveled widely or delved into obscure philosophical texts rediscovered from antiquity or translated from Arab sources, began to question this rigid structure. They were influenced by snippets of Greek sophistry, a philosophical school from ancient times that argued that truth was subjective, dependent on the observer. Protagoras' famous dictum, "Man is the measure of all things," though largely forgotten or condemned, found echoes in these secret circles. They did not simply argue that different people might perceive truth differently, but that truth itself was not fixed. What was true for one might not be true for another. What was moral in one circumstance might not be moral in another. These radical thinkers often formed small, informal groups. They met in quiet corners of bustling marketplaces, pretending to haggle over goods, or in the back rooms of taverns disguised as traveling merchants. They might have been former university students disillusioned with scholasticism, minor clerics chafing under rigid dogma, or even literate artisans with a thirst for independent thought. One such group, rumored to operate in northern Italy during the 13th century, was called the Doubt Weavers. They exchanged ideas through carefully composed riddles and coded messages, ensuring their true intentions were concealed. They collected stories from distant lands, tales of cultures where marriage customs were inverted, where gods were different, where what was considered a crime in one place was a virtue in another. They would gather these narratives, not to marvel at diversity, but to probe the deeper question. If morality truly varied so widely across the known world, could it truly be universal, divinely ordained? Their discussions stretched to logic itself. They debated paradoxes, propositions that seemed sound yet led to contradictory conclusions. If two equally intelligent, equally pious individuals could, through different lines of reasoning, arrive at contradictory conclusions about a theological point, who was to say which truth was correct? Could it be that neither was absolutely correct, or that both were relative to their own understanding? This line of questioning, innocent as it might seem to a modern mind, was explosively dangerous in a world that demanded intellectual conformity. Dismantled the very tools by which theological and philosophical arguments were judged. If truth was relative, then the pronouncements of the Pope, the doctrines of the Church, the very words of the Holy Scriptures themselves could be reduced to mere perspectives, no more valid than any other. The ramifications for morality were equally unsettling. If there were no absolute right or wrong, then every individual became their own judge. There would be no sin, only personal preference. Commandments against theft, murder, or adultery would lose their divine authority, becoming mere societal agreements, subject to change and personal interpretation. Imagine a powerful lord deciding that it was right for him to seize his neighbor's land because his truth allowed it, or a peasant deciding that it was right to steal bread because his truth justified it. The entire social order, which was predicated on a divinely sanctioned hierarchy and a universally accepted moral code, would dissolve into chaos. The fear of God's judgment, which kept many in line, would be undermined. One specific instance was the circulation of a small, unbound collection of essays attributed to a Master Elias in the late 14th century, which resurfaced among a group of dissident scholars in Paris. These essays, carefully disguised as commentaries on Aristotle's logic, contained passages that hinted at the idea that definitions themselves were fluid, that meaning was subjective, and that therefore no statement could claim absolute certainty. Master Elias subtly argued that even concepts like good or evil might only exist in the mind of the observer rather than possessing an intrinsic reality. Such a belief, if widely adopted, would destroy the basis for law, justice, and the very concept of sin. The Church and the feudal lords alike recognized the danger of such ideas, for they bred disobedience and anarchy. Those who dabbled in such relativism were often accused of nihilism, a term perhaps not yet in common use but accurately capturing the perceived threat to all order and meaning. They risked excommunication, ostracization, and the chilling attention of the Holy Inquisition, who saw the erosion of absolute truth as the direct work of the devil designed to plunge humanity into moral darkness. Number 4. The theory of social engineering and the blueprint for a Satanic society. Underneath the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, where everyone knew their place, from the peasant bound to the land to the king anointed by God, a truly subversive idea simmered in hushed conversations and on forbidden parchments. This was the theory of social engineering, combined with a radical vision of a stateless society, a world without lords, kings, or even a dominant church authority. This was not merely the grumbling of an oppressed peasant or the protest of a serf. This was a structured, philosophical challenge to the very foundation of feudalism and ecclesiastic power. The medieval world was a carefully balanced system. The clergy prayed, the nobility fought, and the commoners worked. God had ordained this order. They were told, and to question it was to question divine will itself. Yet, a small, diverse collection of individuals dared to imagine a different world. These were often mendicant friars who had witnessed extreme poverty and corruption firsthand, disillusioned urban craftsmen who felt the weight of oppressive guilds and taxes, or even rogue minor nobility who resented the power of kings. They might have been inspired by misunderstood readings of early Christian communal living, or perhaps by obscure philosophical texts discussing ideal republics, divorced from divine sanction. They congregated in places where their activities could be easily concealed, hidden workshops in burgeoning towns, isolated forest clearings, or even within the walls of certain hospitals and charitable institutions where the downtrodden gathered. They called themselves the Levelers, or the Brotherhood of Equals. Though these names were never spoken aloud, only thought. Their core belief was that human society was not a natural or divinely ordained structure, but a human construct, a design that could be altered. They posited that the suffering of the common people was not God's will, but the result of an unjust system created and maintained by the powerful for their own benefit. They proposed that if this system was a human design, then it could be redesigned. They discussed elaborate blueprints for an alternative society. These blueprints were not crude calls for anarchy, but detailed as sometimes idealistic schemes for communal living. They spoke of shared ownership of land and resources, of decisions made by consensus in local assemblies, of mutual aid replacing taxation, and of justice administered by elected elders rather than hereditary lords. There would be no kings, no feudal obligations, no church hierarchy demanding tithes or obedience. Their writings, often disguised as agricultural manuals or allegorical poems, hinted at these radical notions. One surviving fragment, known as the Commoner's Creed, described a future where the plowman's sweat shall nourish all, and no man shall bow to another save in mutual respect, for all are born of the same dust. They debated the practicalities of such transformation. How could such a society be built? Some argued for a gradual awakening, a slow spread of consciousness among the common people. Others, more radical, discussed the possibility of collective withdrawal, of forming self-sufficient communes in remote areas, away from the control of lords. A few, the most dangerous, even mused about the necessity of direct action, not through violent uprising, but through the systematic dismantling of existing power structures by collective non-compliance, refusing to pay taxes, refusing to perform labor service, refusing to acknowledge the authority. They imagined a society where every man and woman was truly free, where the fruits of their labor belonged to them, and where governance was truly by and for the people, not imposed from above. The very idea of a stateless society, even in theory, was a direct assault on the twin pillars of medieval authority, the church and the monarchy. Church upheld the divine right of kings and the sanctity of the feudal order, seeing any challenge to it as rebellion against God. The monarchies and nobility relied on this established structure for their power, wealth, and legitimacy. If people believed they could live without lords, without taxes, without the church's mediating power, the entire system would collapse. The mere discussion of such possibilities was enough to warrant charges of sedition and heresy. Historical uprisings, such as the Peasants' Revolt in England or various Hussite movements in Bohemia, while not directly stemming from these secret circles, showed glimpses of the underlying yearning for a different social order, a yearning that these secret philosophers were articulating in a far more systematic and dangerous way. The authorities would swiftly and brutally suppress any group even suspected of harboring such ideas, for they knew that the seeds of social engineering, once planted, could blossom into full-scale revolution, ending their privileged existence and the order they believed to be eternal. The very whisper of a world without masters was a thunderclap of defiance. Number 3. The knowledge of ancient pre-Adamic civilizations and lost technologies. Among the musty scrolls and forgotten codices of the medieval period, a truly audacious and deeply heretical idea occasionally surfaced: the existence of ancient civilizations that predated the biblical account of Adam and Eve, cultures that possessed knowledge and technologies far beyond anything known in their own time. This was not mere folklore or fanciful tales of giants. This was a systematic belief fostered in hidden circles that the true history of humanity stretched back far further than the 6,000 years calculated from Scripture, and that this deeper past held secrets that could shatter the Church's narrative of creation and human fall. These secret groups were often comprised of scholars who studied obscure historical texts, alchemists obsessed with the secrets of transformation, or even adventurous travelers who had seen strange ruins in distant lands, ruins that defied explanation within the accepted historical framework. They might have been known as the chronosophists, or the keepers of the forgotten ages. They sought out fragments of apocryphal texts, Gnostic gospels, or even non-Christian histories and myths that spoke of ages before the deluge, of peoples who lived before the time of the patriarchs. They would pore over cryptic diagrams in ancient manuscripts, some depicting mechanical contraptions that seemed impossible, others showing celestial charts far more intricate than any known to their contemporary astronomers. One such group, active in the Iberian Peninsula, where knowledge from Arab and Jewish scholars mingled with Christian thought, discovered and debated the Book of Raziel the Angel, a text of Kabbalistic magic, which, among other things, spoke of the secrets of creation and the powers available to Adam before his fall. While largely interpreted as mystical, a radical interpretation within these circles suggested that Adam, or rather humanity before the fall, possessed a far greater understanding of the natural world and its hidden forces than was commonly believed. This led to the speculation that powerful tools, even methods for manipulating the elements, might have existed in those primeval times. They were not talking about simple tools, but about complex mechanisms, perhaps even flying devices, or methods of moving massive stones that dwarfed anything the medieval builders could achieve. The sheer scale of ancient Roman and Greek structures, often attributed to giants or magical powers, was to them evidence of a forgotten advanced science. The discovery of strange artifacts, occasionally unearthed during farming or construction, would fuel their theories. Polished metal sphere that seemed to hum with an inner energy, a fragment of glass that distorted light in bizarre ways, or a precisely cut stone that defied explanation of its quarrying methods. These were not just curiosities to be dismissed. They were considered tangible proof of a lost pre-Adamic knowledge, a wisdom that had vanished perhaps in a great catastrophe, leaving only tantalizing clues. They believed these lost technologies could allow for the purification of metals, the creation of potent elixirs, or even the manipulation of the human body for extended life. The legendary philosopher's stone, a goal of many alchemists, was not just seen as a mythical substance, but as a potential remnant of this lost knowledge, a key to unlocking forgotten scientific principles. The danger of this knowledge was profound. Church's entire narrative of history was based on the biblical account of creation, the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, and a subsequent linear progression of history towards Christ's redemption. To suggest that highly advanced civilizations existed before Adam and Eve, or even before the Great Flood, shattered this chronology. It implied that God's plan was either different or far more complex than revealed, or that humanity's progress was not linear, but cyclical, with periods of advanced knowledge followed by decline. This challenged the very authority of the Bible and the interpretations offered by the Church Fathers. If there were other histories, what else had the Church obscured or outright suppressed? Moreover, the idea of lost technologies held a double-edged threat. On one hand, it hinted at forbidden knowledge, methods that could be used for worldly power or even to challenge divine order. On the other, it implicitly diminished God's absolute power and wisdom by suggesting that humans, through their own ingenuity, had once achieved feats that seemed almost divine. The search for these lost secrets was often intertwined with magic and necromancy in the minds of the Orthodox, seen as attempts to usurp God's dominion. The chronosophists often shared their findings in hushed tones, meticulously recording their theories in ciphered texts, hiding them behind layers of allegorical tales about ancient kings and mythical beasts. They knew that to openly declare that humanity had once possessed flying machines or advanced metallurgy was not just heresy. It was intellectual treason against the very foundations of medieval belief. The very hint of such an idea was enough to bring down the wrath of those who fiercely guarded the singular, divinely ordained narrative of human history. Ungur 2. The doctrine of self-deification, or inner divinity. Within the cloistered walls of certain monasteries, in the solitary cells of hermits, and in the secretive gatherings of mystics, a truly revolutionary and deeply unsettling idea took root. This was the doctrine of self-deification. The belief that human beings, through rigorous spiritual discipline, profound understanding, or innate essence, could achieve a state of divinity, becoming gods themselves or discovering a divine spark already within them. This was a radical departure from mainstream Christian theology, which firmly maintained a clear distinction between the Creator and the created, between God and humanity. While humans were made in God's image, they were inherently sinful and reliant on divine grace and the sacraments of the Church for salvation. The proponents of this dangerous idea were varied. Some were monks and nuns who pursued mystical union with God with such fervor that they transcended traditional boundaries. Others were Gnostic-leaning thinkers, whose ancient philosophies, suppressed for centuries, periodically re-emerged in hidden forms. Still others were radical alchemists, who believed that the purification of base metals into gold was merely an allegory for the purification of the human soul into a divine state. They were known by names like the Illuminati of the Soul, or the Adepts of Inner Light. They sought to bypass the Church entirely, believing that the path to God lay not through external rituals, sacraments, or the mediation of priests, but through an intensely personal internal journey. They met in secluded places, often in the depths of forests, in hidden caves, or within the walls of isolated castles whose lords held unconventional beliefs. Their core teaching was that the human soul contained a fragment of the divine, a spark of God's own essence. This spark, though obscured by sin and worldly distraction, could be fanned into a blazing flame through contemplation, asceticism, and esoteric knowledge. They argued that Christ's statement, "I and the Father are one," was not unique to him, but a statement of ultimate human potential, a goal for all. They interpreted biblical passages that spoke of humans being children of God, not metaphorically, but literally. They believed that by stripping away worldly desires, by purifying the mind and body, one could shed the illusion of separation from God and realize their true inherent divinity. Some even went so far as to claim that the process of spiritual alchemy could render the physical body immortal or capable of miracles, not through divine intervention from without, but through the awakened power of the divine within. One of the most persistent threads of this doctrine came from certain extreme interpretations of the writings of Meister Eckhart, a 13th-century German mystic. While Eckhart himself was a highly orthodox Dominican friar, some of his radical statements about the uncreated spark in the soul and the unity of the soul with God were seized upon by these secret circles. They twisted his words, claiming that Eckhart meant that humans could become God, not merely unite with him. They wrote their own commentaries on Eckhart's sermons, circulating them among their initiates. These commentaries contained phrases like, "When the soul ascends to its ultimate purity, it is indistinguishable from the Creator, becoming a co-creator of reality itself," a concept that would have been anathema to the established Church. The implications of this idea were explosive. If individuals could achieve divinity on their own, what need was there for the Church, its sacraments, its priests, or even its elaborate theological structure? The entire intermediary role of the clergy, their power to grant salvation, would become meaningless. If every person held the potential for divinity within them, then the Church's control over spiritual truth and the path to heaven would be shattered. This doctrine was not merely heresy, it was the ultimate act of spiritual rebellion, a usurpation of God's unique status, and a direct challenge to the authority of his earthly representatives. It led to accusations of blasphemy and pride, the sin of Lucifer himself, who sought to be like God. Those who practiced or preached this self-deification did so in the utmost secrecy. Their meetings were solemn affairs, involving meditation, study of mystical texts, and sometimes even physical disciplines intended to purify the body. They developed their own secret symbols and coded language to discuss their deepest beliefs, knowing that a single misspoken word could lead to immediate denunciation. The Church, through the Inquisition, relentlessly pursued such individuals, labeling them as dangerous fanatics who threatened the very order of the cosmos and the salvation of souls. They were seen as attempting to ascend to heaven through their own power, bypassing the grace of God, a sin that earned the most severe punishments, including public confession, life imprisonment, or being handed over to the secular authorities for execution by fire. Quiet inner pursuit of divinity was to the medieval authorities a dangerous path towards ultimate damnation, both for the individual and for the wider Christian community. Number 1. The belief in the illusion of reality and the manipulability of perception. In the darkest corners of medieval thought, hidden from the light of common reason and orthodox dogma, a truly mind-bending and terrifying idea simmered: the belief that the reality humans perceived was not absolute or fixed, but a mere illusion, a construct that could be manipulated, altered, or even shattered. This was not a simple philosophical skepticism about what one could know. This was a radical proposition that the very fabric of existence that defined their world might be a grand deception, and that certain arcane knowledge could grant the power to reshape that illusion, to create new realities or force others to perceive what was not truly there. This idea found adherents among a strange mix of people: rogue philosophers who had delved too deeply into Neoplatonic texts, alchemists who sought to transmute not just matter but consciousness itself, and certain practitioners of forbidden magic who believed in the power of the mind over the physical world. They were often referred to as the dream weavers or the masters of form, and their circles were the most secretive of all, shrouded in layers of misdirection and deception. They might meet in abandoned churches, where the echo of prayers felt like a mockery of their true beliefs, or in isolated towers, their laboratories filled not with beakers and retorts, but with strange instruments for focusing thought and light. Their philosophical roots lay in distorted interpretations of ancient Greek skepticism, combined with esoteric doctrines from the Middle East, and even some radical Gnostic ideas that viewed the material world as fundamentally flawed, a prison created by a lesser, imperfect deity. They argued that human perception was inherently flawed, susceptible to error, and easily tricked. If the senses could be fooled by a skilled illusionist, they reasoned, then perhaps the entire world was merely a grand illusion woven by a powerful hidden entity, or by an even more terrifying possibility, by the collective agreement of human minds themselves. One group, operating out of a hidden scriptorium in a Sicilian town, exchanged coded letters, discussing the concept of Maya, a term they adapted from obscure Eastern texts, interpreting it as the cosmic illusion that veiled ultimate truth. They speculated that if one could pierce this veil, one could then, perhaps, learn to weave it anew. The dangerous leap came with the second part of their belief: the manipulability of perception. If reality was an illusion, then it could be undone or reshaped. They explored techniques not unlike those later attributed to hypnotism or advanced psychological suggestion to alter the perceptions of others. They sought ways to induce vivid, shared hallucinations to make people see things that were not there or fail to see things that were. Their methods involved complex rituals of focused attention, the use of certain herbs or fumes to alter consciousness, and intricate patterns of light and sound designed to disorient the mind. They documented their experiments in cryptic journals, filled with diagrams of concentric circles and strange sigils, each representing a pathway to a different mental state or a method for inducing a specific illusion. A notable example was a document found hidden in the wall of a ruined manor house, later dubbed the Treatise of the Shifting Sands. Described exercises for seeing beyond the veil, where practitioners would gaze at mundane objects until their forms seemed to melt and reshape, and then try to project those altered perceptions onto another person. The implications of this belief were catastrophic for the medieval world. If reality itself was not to be trusted, if what one saw, heard, and touched could be altered by a hidden master of illusion, then there was no certainty, no objective truth, no stable ground for law or faith. A witness in court could be manipulated to give false testimony. A king's subjects could be made to see him as a monstrous beast. The very miracles attributed to saints or to Christ could be dismissed as elaborate illusions. The authority of the Church, which relied on the objective truth of its doctrines and the reality of divine intervention, would shatter. If the world was a lie, then God's creation itself was a lie. This idea bred a profound paranoia. No one could be trusted. What if the person next to you was not truly there, but merely a projected image? What if the bread and wine of the Eucharist were not truly transformed, but merely appeared to be so through a powerful deception? The belief in the manipulability of perception also directly challenged the very existence of a rational, ordered cosmos governed by God's unchanging laws. It opened the door to utter chaos, to a world where truth was a weapon and reality a plaything for those with forbidden knowledge. The Church, recognizing the profound threat this posed to all order, both spiritual and temporal, branded such beliefs as the most insidious form of diabolism, an attempt to sow discord and madness directly from the pit of hell. Those suspected of being dream weavers were hunted down with unparalleled zeal, often facing immediate torture and execution, their minds and bodies broken in a desperate attempt to erase the terrifying knowledge that reality itself might be nothing more than a carefully constructed and dangerously